Good afternoon. We're so pleased that you could join us this afternoon for the Community Foundation panel on connecting donors and communities for lasting impact. My name is Julie Juergens. I'm a director at the Center for Social Innovation here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And before we begin, I just want a round of applause for our amazing students that organized this panel, Maggie MacArthur and Lauren Martin. Put in a tremendous amount of effort so that we could be here with you this afternoon. We have with us today, I cannot think of a more esteemed panel of speakers to talk about community foundations. So these really are the experts in the field. These are the thought leaders. And we have with us today Peter Hero, who is the president of the Community Foundation of Silicon Valley, James Head, who is the director of programs for the San Francisco Community Foundation, and Richard Kai, who is the CEO of the International Community Foundation. So it's just a tremendous pleasure for us to kind of welcome this esteemed panel this afternoon. In terms of the format, what I'll do is I'll kind of give a brief overview of the Community Foundation panel, and then I'll turn it over to our panelists who will hopefully give us a few words about their backgrounds, and then talk about their individual models, their respective models, and how they are organized and how they're different from one another. Then I have a few questions for the panelists, and we hope to leave about 40 minutes for Q&A with you all. So that's kind of the way that we'll proceed this afternoon. So the traditional image of a community foundation has been seen as serving a city, a county, or a specific geographic region. So community was defined by geography. However, now with the shifts in how the world operates, geography is just one way in which people identify with their communities. And a community foundation's focus is to meet the needs of the communities they serve. The first community foundation was founded in 1914 in Cleveland, Ohio. I learned that from Peter. And now, less than 100 years later, there are about 650 community foundations in the United States, most of which are quite small, under $10 million in assets. And outside of the United States now, there are about 400 community foundations. And Richard will talk with us about that phenomenon. Community foundations are different from traditional private foundations like the Hewlett Foundation or the Rockefeller Foundation. For one, they are both grant-making organizations as well as grant-seeking organizations. So they are in the business of raising resources from a community on behalf of a community. They are 501c3 organizations, and our panelists have all spent a portion of their time fundraising. In fact, there is an article that nicknamed Peter as the salesman. They play three major roles. First, and the most obvious, is around giving, and their giving reflects the needs of the communities in which they serve. But they also play a convening role. So they bring together different stakeholders, as in government, business, nonprofits, donors, to address a community issue. So they're very kind of multi-sectoral in their reach. They also, the third way that their kind of third major role is through connecting. So they connect people to ideas, they connect resources to causes, and even though it might not be kind of by first blush, they connect nonprofits to other nonprofits in the area of kind of doing similar work. So now I'd like to turn it over to our panelists, who, again, will spend a few minutes on themselves and their background, and then talk about their models and the differences in their different community foundations. Peter?
Okay. Well, it's great to be here. Good turnout. What a terrific conference. I had lunch with Al Gore. What an incredible person. I didn't hear his talk this morning, but what a guy. Very impressive. So I went to business school here back in the dark ages a long time ago. And Ernie Arbuckle, whose picture is in the Arbuckle Lounge, was the dean then and was a mentor for me over many years. And then I had a career in business, in startup companies, and went back to school to get a PhD in art history. I thought I wanted to run an art museum. I never have, but I've done some other interesting things, including being president of a college of art and design. And then I came here 17 years ago, and Ernie was the chair of my foundation, tragically, just before he died. And it was great to come back here, and here I am, and here I've been for the last 17 years. I want to tell you today a little bit about my foundation and what we've developed as sort of a donor-centric structure, and I'll tell you why we've structured ourselves that way and why we think that approach makes sense for charitable development in this region, and then I'll be interested in your comments and questions. And it's true, as Julie said, that the first community foundation was started in 1914 in Cleveland by a banker named Frederick Goff, who looked around and realized there were dozens and dozens of charitable funds that had been created at trust companies and banks, and by then often for diseases that had been cured or causes that were no longer relevant. So we had the idea of sweeping them all together into a community fund, and so from the beginning the idea was creating a savings account for future needs. And if you think of Cleveland in 1914, it was the Silicon Valley of the Industrial Revolution with steel and coal, oil, gas. 50 years later, it was a blighted, rundown city that was environmentally in such sad shape that its river used to spontaneously catch on fire. Imagine. But by then, the community foundation, this fund of money, had grown and people had contributed, and it contributed to the revitalization of the city. But from the beginning, the idea was very much based on endowment and grant making. When I came here in 1988, I realized that we were in a very different kind of region. This is a region of immigrants from around the country and around the world. There really is no old wealth, old families who care about Silicon Valley as their community. There wasn't, and there isn't still, a strong civic infrastructure, old families, expected behavior, philanthropic involvement. Instead, there were these thousands of people who had moved here to Silicon Valley, but didn't grow up here, didn't know the nonprofits, often had come to their wealth very quickly, and weren't immediately going to start giving back to the community, however you define it, without some significant assistance. We did find these people were highly networked, very idealistic, and we did a study which was interesting that showed that we asked them, what influences your charitable giving to the extent you get involved in the community? And it turned out that the workplace was the single most important influence on their behavior. And their peers in the workplace. In fact, compared to national data, the workplace here has as much influence as the church does in other parts of the United States on charitable giving. So we set out to try to capture that dynamic, that is, to respond to that dynamic of these donors, this place, and to try to, in effect, make philanthropy part of the culture of this region. And at that time, in 1998, it really wasn't. There was Dave and Bill, these two sort of Olympic icons, and then there was everyone else. And if you weren't Mr. Hewlett or Mr. Packard, it wasn't necessarily the case that you should do anything in the community. It was really quite extraordinary. So we did several things, and I have over here some copies of an article from Fortune magazine and also a case study that's used by the business school on our foundation, which I think are electronically. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So they will tell you more, but I want to just quickly skip through it and then hope it'll provoke a conversation. What we set out to do was really to become a center for philanthropy, be a place where we could engage and connect these donors, as Julie said, not only to causes, but to each other, to learn from each other. And we created a donor circle, a network called SV2, the Silicon Valley Social Venture Fund, which is like a charitable giving club where people put money into a common pool and participate in making large grants from that pool. We have nearly 200 people in that, and it continues to grow. And they meet almost monthly, if you can believe it. And so it's professionally, socially, and charitably a way for these people to connect to this community, to each other, and to learn what it means to be thoughtfully involved in the community. So networking, building donor connections to each other, sparking off each other, and what they can learn from each other. We realized that the workplace was extraordinarily important, and we spent a great deal of time promoting philanthropy among corporations. We currently do all the giving for 26 major corporations in Silicon Valley who, when I came here, didn't do any giving at all. And that array is continuing to build. And we think that's very important because that's really saying it's not okay to be stingy in Silicon Valley, that it's important to pay attention to the community. And a few years ago, during the bubble, Remember the bubble? It was so great. During the bubble, I went to John Chambers at Cisco, and I said, John, how are your 9,000 employees going to find out about charitable giving and about the foundation and what their opportunities are? He said, I don't know, you tell me. And I said, I want to open an office of my foundation right here in your headquarters. And I said, I want you to pay for it. And he said, okay. This was the bubble, after all. And our office is still there. And Cisco, and I'm not taking the credit for it because their leadership was very generous, is one of the most generous companies. And we have a charitable intranet within the company. And people are finding out about volunteerism, about giving, about hurricane relief, all sorts of things. But again, there isn't a structure to find out that kind of information unless it was established. So a great deal with corporations. And then finally, we spend a good deal of time with what Julie talked about in terms of being a convener, to be kind of a neutral third party in the best sense of neutral. Not that we don't stand for anything, but rather that we're open to ideas and different kinds of causes and different needs. And we do research and develop coalitions of corporations, government, and donors around key matters here. About 10 years ago, with help from an intern from Stanford Business School over the summer, we brought all the banks together. There's 20 of them in this region, and all of them are required to loan and give money in red-lined areas. The Community Reinvestment Act requires it. Well, they didn't know those areas, didn't know the leadership, didn't know the nonprofits, and yet they were required to loan money there. We knew the leadership, the neighborhoods, the nonprofits, but we couldn't get the money. So we put the two together, and Lenders for Community Development, which was created and incubated at our shop and now spun off as a separate organization run by Eric Weaver, a terrific guy also from the business school. So in effect, we've endowed this region with a new organization which has gone on giving millions and millions of dollars for economic development, low-income housing, small business development. But how do those banks connect to the community? We're kind of the gearbox that can make those things happen. I think over time then, what we've seen is enormous growth in our foundation. Assets are always a simple measure of growth, not necessarily effectiveness or quality, but certainly growth. We've grown from about $7 million to almost $800 million in assets in those 17 years, and we give away about $1.5 million a week, 35% of which leaves the region, and a big part of that goes outside the country because that's where many of our donors have interests, and we'll hear more about that from Richard. We engage our donors, we take them on site visits, we get their kids involved, we run workshops, because we believe we're dealing with a region that if we don't do that basic kind of work, that money, those donors may well disappear, but certainly not be involved. So in sum, I think what's characterized our growth is to help show donors that giving can be measurable, hands-on, high impact. I like to say people in Silicon Valley give to solutions, not to problems. They don't know where to find those solutions, many of which have been created by themselves as they work on it. And that over time, we think our greatest contribution beyond the assets we've aggregated and the donors who become more animated is that philanthropy has become part of the culture of Silicon Valley, and that's what we think is the most important part of what we do.
Thank you, James. And I should say that we are so pleased that James could be with us this afternoon. Unfortunately, Sandra Hernandez had a family emergency that she needed to tend to, and so James has graciously stepped in at the last minute, and we're so appreciative.
Thank you, Julie. I won't profess to be able to give you the kind of presentation that Sandra would probably give you, because those of you who know Sandra know how dynamic she is in terms of the leadership and knowledge of the issues related to the foundation. I'm the director of programs at the San Francisco Foundation. I oversee all of the program giving and the program giving staff at the foundation. I've been at the foundation a little bit over a year, about a year and 3 months now. Before that, I spent a little bit over 25 years as a lawyer in public interest work in Georgia, Florida, and then here in California. 18 of those years I spent as president of an organization called the National Economic Development Law Center, which is based in Oakland, California, and is a national technical assistance, legal and business intermediary that provides assistance to neighborhoods, community-based organizations, governmental agencies, foundations, and others around economic development strategies. So I come to the foundation world, I think, with a little bit of a different perspective, one that is, I think, grounded in the issues that most community foundations try to address in their communities. But I think also uniquely grounded in issues related to economic development, which is my passion and is I think, a critical and important component to this. The foundation was founded in 1948 by civic leaders, including a business leader named Dan Koshland. And its mission is to mobilize resources in communities and act as a catalyst for change, which I think are sort of bold words when you think about community foundations in some ways, but I think has sort of stayed true to that mission. It, like Peter's foundation, has a little bit over $800 million in assets and gives away close to $65 million a year in grant making. About 15 million of that is what we call unrestricted grant making, which comes from the corpus of our assets. And almost 40 million of that actually comes from donor advice giving and other vehicles through which the foundation allows donors to contribute and participate. We're a regional foundation, which makes us a little bit different. We actually cover 5 regions in the Bay Area. And our program areas include arts and culture, neighborhood and community development, community health. I think that we're one of the few foundations actually that has a program area specifically devoted to social justice. And then education is the 6th area. We also do a number of initiatives that are directly focused on specific issues in communities, including a leadership program called the Koshland Neighborhood Program. In addition to sort of establishing the foundation, Dan Koshland put some extra money aside to create a civic engagement and leadership program within the foundation that actually fosters leadership at the local level. We have a West Oakland initiative that focuses on a high school in West Oakland and some of the issues there, an environmental justice initiative, a small schools initiative, and then a workforce collaborative project and initiative. I mentioned the initiatives because I think that this combination of initiatives and our sort of regular grant making is what makes us, from my standpoint, a sort of program-centric foundation. And what I mean by that is that the San Francisco Foundation purposely attempts to balance its responsive grant making, which I think is a hallmark of community foundations, with a proactive approach to trying to address problems in the communities that we serve. And the reason we've gone that route, I think, there are a number of things that I think influences the foundation's approach there. One of them is that the communities that we work in and the issues that we try to address mandate that we have both a responsive and a proactive approach. Issues in the communities that the foundation works in are very complex issues. They're very entrenched issues, and they require a great deal of attention and a great deal of energy, not only sort of monetary resources, but human capital to them. Secondly, I think that our foundation is attempting to recognize that within a number of these communities, there are already really great infrastructures that have been developed there, and we have tried, I think, to a large extent, and have been, I think, somewhat successful, although probably not fully successful, in developing the kinds of partnerships with organizations, with institutions that are working in these communities to assist and to support the work that they're doing. Thirdly, as a program-centric foundation, half the staff at the foundation actually in some way work in program, which is, I think, also a little bit of a difference in terms of community foundations. Although we have, as Peter mentioned, we do have a resource development unit and staff that focuses on donors and donor relations and bringing money in. It's a smaller staff. Has not worked as closely with program in the past, and it's something that we're beginning to sort of look at and acknowledge. I say to our donor relations staff that of that 40 million or so that the donors give, I'd love to get my hands on about 15 or 20 million of it and direct it to some of the things that we are specifically involved in. But that's, I think, probably a good place for a question later on in terms of how to make that happen. The foundation also looks to balance the support that we give, especially in the areas of sort of service delivery, with what we think are some of the other complex issues that need to be addressed by communities of color, by low-income and working communities. And those include support for policy work that has to be done, I think, in order to really set the stage to be successful in these communities. We do a significant amount of convening, as Peter mentioned, as a way to really sort of bring stakeholders to the table, help to sort of identify ways to address issues that we can't address fully. Some work around research and some work around technical assistance. So what are the issues for us in some ways in terms of this program-centric model? I think one I mentioned earlier, one of the issues is that we are not as aligned to the donors as we would like to be. Our donors have sort of a range of causes. I think that donors are great. I sometimes think, though, that they don't understand the complex nature of poverty, for example, and the issues that it takes to address that nature. There's a difference between, I think, supporting a homeless shelter and actually trying to eradicate homelessness. And so we try to look to align an ability to have a balance between trying to do both of those, and are beginning to see, I think, some levels of interest by donors in the more difficult pieces. Secondly, the work in these communities is difficult to do, partly because you can't specifically quantify and easily quantify the return on investments. It takes a long period of time for change to happen in many of these communities, and some of our donors are not as patient as I have been over my 25 plus years. But we are sort of getting there, and I think I see some places where that is happening. Lastly, we do a fair amount of policy work, as I mentioned earlier, and some of this work can be pretty controversial. I'll talk a bit later, I think, in the question and answers about some specific case studies that we've done around some of that work. But in many instances, we will take on issues sometimes that are within our mission, but may not be a favorite issue of some of our donors. I tend to hope when we do that they're our smaller donors rather than our big donors. But at the same time, we struggle with this issue of how to be responsive to the things that communities want us to do, even if they are very complex and not popular issues, and how to also ensure that donors are comfortable that the San Francisco Foundation is a place where they can put resources and have those resources go to good use. So I'll stop there and wait for questions.
Thank you.
Well, I'm Richard Kime, and I represent the International Community Foundation. I'll give you a little background on how I got into this work. About 22 years ago, I was sitting over where you were at. I was an undergrad here at Stanford, a senior. I attended a conference sponsored by the business school called Public Entrepreneurship, You Can Make a Difference. And there was a speaker, John Gardner, the late John Gardner. He passed away a few years ago, who gave a remarkable speech. And that speech inspired me to pursue a career in public service and really make public entrepreneurship my passion. And I've tried to do that in my various careers, both in the public sector, in the private sector, where I was very active on boards of nonprofits, and now running a nonprofit, a foundation. So it's wonderful to be back and to be here at GSB, which actually organized that conference around the inauguration of their public management program. So anyway, it's great. I'm going to talk a little about the International Community Foundation and the way we've redefined the concept of community in the context of charitable giving. So I'm going to just, I'm sorry. Can you just fix this real quick? This is the traditional definition. We talked about, I'm not going to dwell on this much, but The traditional community foundation has tended to be very fixated on geography. There are a few exceptions, and Peter's one of them, one of the few in the country. But we've really sought to challenge that. And I'll get into that in a little bit. But in today's world, with globalization, human migration, the mobility that we have today, and the internet, it's difficult to define community strictly in geographic terms. And we're finding that in many cases donors have multiple communities. Go to the next slide. The donors are looking for ways that they can connect with these communities. And when I talk about donors, I'm not talking about just individuals. Corporations are looking for ways to connect. We're in the San Diego area, and we have many companies in San Diego that have global offices. And they're trying to figure out how they can be responsible as corporate citizens. So they're trying to define corporate responsibility beyond their corporate headquarter location. But how to do that? And one of the ways is to reach out to community foundations. But the problem is community foundations are a bit limiting in their traditional sense because of the way they define their own boundaries. And that really has given rise to opportunities for international giving and what's given really rise to the International Community Foundation. We were created about 15 years ago. We were created by the San Diego Foundation. And initially we were created as a donor-advised fund to facilitate giving to Tijuana. We're a border town. And there are a lot of people that want to give across the border. And for many years, it was a donor-advised fund that was used around Christmas time to give the orphanage across the border a small gift. And it was largely inactive. I took ICF over a little over 4 years ago, and they were doing about $360,000 in grants. Today we're doing about $4 million, and we're growing. And what I realized, and I was in the private sector when I took this on, I began volunteering with them. And I love Baja. When I was a little kid, we used to go down to go scuba diving, and I remember going fishing down there. And I have so many of my friends that go down there, and I realized there's a huge American community, and there was an enormous opportunity to engage this American second home market in giving, but then looking at the broader opportunity for giving abroad. And so what I did is I got recruited for this, and I decided to really broaden the parameters of the way the International Community Foundation was looking at their giving, and basically just said, look, we're not going to be focusing just on Tijuana. We're going to be looking at the peninsula, and we're going to be the dominant grant maker in the peninsula, but we're also going to help facilitate giving for donors that want to give to their communities of origin. Today, about 22% of our donors are immigrants, foreign nationals. And that's the other way we've tried to connect the dots. So in many respects, we're addressing donor needs on a number of levels. We're addressing the second home buyer market. According to the consulate in Tijuana, there's about 200,000 Americans that are either living full-time or part-time in Baja. We have 50,000 cross-border commuters. These are people that are coming across the border each day to work in San Diego. So we live in a blurred border. And so in that context, we're having to address some very local but cross-border issues. We're dealing with a unique second home buyer market in Baja, and then we're dealing with individuals and companies looking to give in other places. So the reason we really exist is really to provide this opportunity for donors, recognizing that most giving in the United States tends to be domestic. In 2002, less than 2% of giving was international. Now, Bill Gates, thanks to some of his giving recently, has upped that number. But by and large, the majority of giving is domestic. And then if you look at where the majority of dollars goes, it goes to international NGOs, like the Red Cross, like TNC, like Conservation International, wonderful organizations. But if you look at the trickle down and the amount of money that goes to foreign nonprofits, It's very small. In 2002, it was about $830 million, which is not a lot of money when you look at the amount of money that's given here in this country. Our niche is really in servicing those foreign nonprofits and giving individual donors the ability to get money across the border and do that efficiently. This is just the pie. As you can see, it was in 2002, you were looking at $4.6 billion going internationally out of a $240 billion pie. And of that, 830 was going to foreign nonprofits directly. So this is our region, our primary region. And as you can see, it is a binational region. It's the largest binational region in North America with about 4.5 million people. We're not just working with high net worth immigrants. We've begun recently working with migrant workers. We've embarked on an initiative which we call the Ties That Bind Us, and we are engaging migrant workers from Oaxaca to give back to their communities of origin. And we're approaching companies and saying, hey, you're employing these Oaxaqueños. Let's go in on a matching program. And that's what we're beginning to do in the San Diego area, targeting employers and the migrant workers in the North County, in the flower industry in particular. What's wonderful about this is we can show donors that you don't have to be a millionaire to be a philanthropist. You can be you could be growing, picking flowers and earning minimum wage, and you can still make a difference. And particularly, you go to places like Oaxaca, you work in China, and you can make an enormous impact with very little money. And that's the power of international giving. As I indicated, one of the things we try to do is engage companies, individuals, and we're finding more and more companies seeking us out because since 9/11 and the enactment of the U.S. Patriot Act, it's become much more cumbersome for companies to give across borders. So many of them actually have decreased their giving internationally, but at a time when American companies need to be more global, and their giving needs to be also more global in nature. Companies are increasingly looking to intermediaries like us, and there are several others. Here in the Bay Area, you've got Give to Asia, another great organization in New York is called CAF. And so these intermediaries are increasingly serving the needs of corporations and large family foundations to begin addressing some of the opportunities that exist for charitable giving abroad. We last year, as a result of the tsunami, we embarked on an interesting partnership with the UN Foundation. We worked on an interesting deal with the UN Foundation in 2003. We partnered to create a conservation easement and conservation management program for an island in the Sea of Cortez called Isla Espiritu Santo. But what we also did is we worked to try to get UNESCO status for that island and the other islands of the Gulf. So together in our grant making, we were able to catalyze an initiative that led to the formalization of UNESCO status for 244 islands in the Sea of Cortez. So it was an enormous success, and that partnership led to us beginning to look for other ways that we could work together. And about the time we started talking about that, the tsunami hit, and we said, look, we need to work together on the tsunami. And as a result, we brought 11 community foundations together from around the country to work with us. UN provided us a matching grant on a 1-to-2 basis, and we were able to raise about $1.3 million. So we felt that it was a really powerful way to engage community foundations that would otherwise not be thinking global to be more responsive to a crisis that was impacting South Asia. So in conclusion, what I guess my parting word is that in today's world, people need to think more globally. You need to think more globally and act locally. I feel that in the context of your conference, there's a lot that you're thinking about in terms of future careers. Philanthropy is certainly one way to go, but there's a lot that you can do in a charitable context, whether you're going this route or working for a company. The values that you impart in your organization can go a long way to making a difference. And so I hope that you get a lot out of this conference, and hopefully we'll make a difference in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you to all of our panelists. And I just have a few questions that I want to pose to our panelists, and feel free, all three of you, to jump in, or whatever suits you. So my question is, what is your greatest challenge or your greatest challenges that you face?
Well, I'll start. I think the greatest challenge to greater civic engagement and more philanthropy is basically apathy and conspicuous consumption. I think most of the people, truly, and I think that most of the people I work with are idealistic. They want to be helpful, but they often don't know where to begin. And as that Fortune article sets forth, and it's true, I was talking to a guy from Google the other day, and I said, well, what are you interested in? Children or health care, the environment? And there was a long silence, and he looked at me and said, well, what do you got? In other words, this is just not something that they've had to think about before. So I think the greatest challenge is to help people understand that there are ways they can be involved and effectively involved. They can invest in the community. No, I'm looking at it from a donor standpoint. From a community standpoint or a program standpoint, the greatest challenge, I think, is obviously there's never enough money to do the things you want to do, but it's also the challenge of what James was talking about, creating coalitions of people and organizations and nonprofits to attack in a sustained year after year way embedded issues like homelessness, and to have the patience and the kind of drive to stick with it and work on it over time and make changes that often come very slowly. During the internet times, there was this hubris that set in, particularly among business people, that, well, we can fix these problems. Why don't you run the school like a business? We can, that's not the answer. And so I think it's all that I've said, plus crossing this divide between profit and nonprofit, getting groups to work together. And as you said, Julie, I don't know how many times I've brought nonprofit leaders in together who work in the same field. They don't even know each other. It's just unbelievable. So I think that fracturing of the sector is also a challenge. So there's more than one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just say there's one for me, and that would be the potential we have for falling into the trap of allowing many to assume that government should do less and philanthropy should do more. I think our greatest challenge is holding government to its responsibility, which is to take care of its people. And I think that the recent events related to the destruction in the Gulf Coast sort of demonstrates for us that we still have a long way to go, and that it has sparked a little bit of a debate around sort of that issue. But at the same time, I think that it's critical that we, are able to really sort of keep separate the notions of what government should do to address many of the issues, and then how philanthropy can support that from the standpoint, at least in my mind, of providing flexible dollars that can be used in a creative way.
Yeah, I think one of my biggest challenges is organizationally trying to get scale in an organization that has the name the International Community Foundation, when the traditional community foundation model is based on a management fee, which tends to be fairly low. If you read that community foundation report, which is on the table, you'll find that very few community foundations in the United States are doing well financially. Above $250 million, you see a number of very successful ones. Silicon Valley is certainly one of the successful community foundations. There's a lot of small, struggling ones. So how do you get scale, particularly when you have extensive geography to deal with? We've been really focusing on Baja California as our primary target market, because in a traditional venture capital mode, you get too far away from your geography, and it gets to be very expensive. So about 60% of our grant making is focused in that primary target market. And then for other geographic areas, we tend to be fairly selective. We go into markets where we have country knowledge, we have the language knowledge, and we can be able to provide value added to our donors. That means saying no to a lot of donors, too, because we can't service all markets. We would obviously like to grow into to other parts of the world, but there are limits. And so while we are redefining the definition of community, we are finding that there are limits to be able to do it and do it sustainably.
Well, now I'd like to ask you to kind of step back from your day-to-day operations and think kind of big picture and vision. And where do you see things headed in 5, 10, 20 years? So what does the future look like for community foundations?
Well, I just say one trend that I see happening is this enormous globalization of philanthropy. Some of the things Richard talked about. There are now as many community foundations outside of America, North America, as there are in community foundations in Kenya and South Africa and Australia, India, and Thailand. There's a terrific community foundation in Zimbabwe that was started by this dynamite woman there who has an endowment of $6,000 created by 6,000 women giving $1. And you have no idea how that's changed that community in terms of if we can do this, what do we do next? And I think this sense of civic engagement and involvement and eventually connecting these, what's now about 1,500 community foundations around the world, and it's growing rapidly, with each other, with resources, and so forth, I think is a trend, and I don't know where it's all going to go, but I think it has the potential of creating a network of intermediaries that are not only building civic engagement from the bottom up, but helping allocate resources from the top down from other parts of the world.
I would say two things. A recent study on the future of community foundations that was sort of sponsored by the Ford and Mott foundations sort of identified 4 or 5 what they thought was sort of
Which we actually have a copy here, so you can take it on your way out.
Era pieces. One of them, which I totally agree with, was the notions that the shift from an industrial economy to an information-based one had sort of created sort of new challenges for us related to poverty, to politics, and to global relationships. I would add to that probably that in many communities around the country, the shift has not been to information-based sort of economies, but more to either retail or tourist-based economies, which are creating barely sustainable employment opportunities and makes, I think, even more difficult. So I just think the whole change that is happening in the country around economics and the economy is one of them. The other that they mentioned that I think is critically important is the fact that we as a country are changing rapidly, and the America that we have today, at least the face of it, is going to be different in 2050 and beyond. It will be a much more diverse. It will be an America that is a majority-minority in terms of people of color. And I think that it will have a significant impact on what we do. And in that regard, I think that we will need to, in the community foundation world especially, spend a lot more time cultivating and creating opportunities for individuals and companies and others of color to be part of philanthropy, which is something that my foundation, I think, has not done a great job at yet, and we are working hard on. But I think other foundations would probably sort of fess up to that. The last one is sort of this issue of sort of the increasing regulatory and public scrutiny that we are beginning to face. I think the Patriot Act, I think, is a good example of the fact that foundations are also, even those that don't give a lot internationally, being sort of pressured to do additional checking of who the organizations are, and I think that is a sort of a real concern of many of us in terms of what we do, and the whole sort of climate in Congress around increased IRS and federal regulatory sort of scrutiny, some of which I think has been deserved in terms of some of the issues that we have brought on ourselves, but much of which I think will really limit the ability of community foundations to really do the things that we're being asked to do in the communities that we serve.
Yeah, I think looking 5-10 years out, I think one of the challenges but opportunities for community foundations is really rediscovering their community. If you look at the philanthropic marketplace, the real value added that community foundations provide is their community-based knowledge. Today, there are a lot more products out there to do donor-advised giving. In fact, Fidelity sort of shook up the whole marketplace when they created their charitable gift fund. And since then, you've had other derivations of that with Schwab and others creating these gift funds. Well, community foundations are now competing with entities like Fidelity and Schwab. So where's the value added? And it's really in the community-based knowledge. A Schwab is not going to have program officers that know specific neighborhoods or specific needs in a community. Now, piggybacking on Peter's comment about the global movement in community foundations, I think this is where this network comes in, because to the extent that you've got a cadre of community foundation professionals looking at their community, but also network with other communities, you begin to provide a value proposition to donors that's second to none. Before this session started, Peter and I were talking about the trend in second home buying. And among a lot of high net worth individuals, you're looking at multiple homes. A number of our donors are, in fact, living in multiple locations. I mean, we have donors that are living in Shanghai and Rancho Santa Fe and San Diego and Beijing and Baja and San Diego. And increasingly, we're seeing that this is a trend that is not just limited domestically, but it's global. And so I think that as this community foundation network evolves, there's going to be a better network available among community foundations to be able to serve donors. And I think that's going to be the competitive advantage that this segment of the market has.
Thank you. Well, we have an audience of MBA students whose career is on their minds, and so I'd like to ask you all, and we have a panel, on this panel alone, we have an MBA, a lawyer, and a public servant. So if you could talk a little bit about your personal career path, how you ended up where you are today, and why you ended up there.
Well, I'll be very brief. I'd really like to hear from you guys as well, have more of a conversation. But my advice is when you get out of here, try and find a job at a community foundation. It's the best. I can't think of a better job because unlike traditional foundations like the Packard Foundation, you're raising money, managing money, and giving money away, and you have the opportunity to bring about enormous change in your lifetime, wherever you're working or internationally. It's the most gratifying thing I've done. But as I said earlier, I started working in business with small company startups and did that for about 9 years. And then went back to school and was thinking of working mainly in the education area, museums, and I ended up doing this. I think the MBA provides you with some terrific tools, and I think what you've got to do is look within yourself and decide how do you want to employ those tools and what can I do where I can make a living, make a difference, and go home each night knowing that I've made a difference, and get up in the morning thinking what you do that day might be entirely different from the day before, which I really like. So I started in business, ended up in the nonprofit sector. Others have done it the other way around. But I think it's a very personal decision, and you've got to look within yourself. And I had absolutely no idea I'd be doing this when I got out of business school. If someone told me that, I would have said, you're crazy, you're not talking about me. So the other thing is to be flexible and hang loose about it and take the opportunities that seem to make the most sense to you, and don't worry too much about what sector they're in.
Well, I've been in the nonprofit sector pretty much all of my life. I have not been in the business arena, and I guess what I would say is, working in the nonprofit sector, you will barely make a living, but you can make a living. I spent a significant amount of the 25 plus years in the nonprofit sector sort of asking community foundations and any other foundation I could find for money. I must admit it's much better to sort of be on the other side and at least have some money to give, although the need is so great that even that is not as easy as I thought or suspected that it would be. I think that there's a good deal of need, especially from the economic side of this, in the communities that we work in. For students and people who have business degrees. I think that we're beginning to understand that we have to deal with the economic infrastructures in these communities, especially low-income communities of color, that we have to deal with the fact that, as Richard was saying, that asset development accumulation through home ownership and other kinds of vehicles ought to also be a part of the strategies that we work on, and that we have to build sort of the human leadership that understands these concepts, understands how to use the market and how to keep the market from having too much of a negative influence to make it work. And so I think that those are all, there's sort of a lot of dream places to sort of make a difference. But you won't make much money, but you'll certainly make a difference.
As I mentioned, I've been in all three sectors, and I took the job at the International Community Foundation when I was in the private sector. I was working for a emerging market retailer and a company called PriceSmart, which was a spin-off of the original Price Club. And I was their senior VP for business development. And I was spending a lot of time traveling all over Central America, the Caribbean, and we had just opened up in the Philippines. So I was spending all my time on the road. I have 2 young kids, and I wasn't seeing a lot of them. And they hired me originally to help them start this was during the dot-com bubble. Mm-hmm. They hired me actually to launch an e-commerce portal for Central America and the Caribbean. Put together the business plan, and then the bubble burst in April of 2000, and the board decided they're going to stick to brick and mortar. And so I said, what am I doing here? And I began volunteering. My background is environmental policy, and I started volunteering with the San Diego Foundation. And they then connected me with the International Community Foundation because of my international experience, and I helped them set up an environmental border fund. And then their CEO had retired, and they said, well, Richard, why don't you think about this? And, it was an interesting proposition because they had about $120,000 operating income. They had been doing about, as I said, 316 grants. And my wife, when I talked to her about it, she said, well, don't quit your day job. And I realized I couldn't. So I was doing both for a while. And I worked out a deal with Park. I said, look, I'm not passionate about my work. I'm not a retailer. I'm a policy wonk. Mm-hmm. And so I said, look, I want to do this thing, but I can't afford to do it because the plane's not going to leave the tarmac if I just take the job. So I worked 2 jobs for about 5 months and raised the necessary money to be able to run the operation and hire an additional person for a year. So in a sense, it was a startup. Yeah. And it's been very entrepreneurial, and I've tried to create a very entrepreneurial climate inside because we're still in I think a very much of a start growth mode. But that's how I got into it. It's been a lot of fun, and it's been one of the most rewarding things that I've done. And one of the things that helped me realize is that you have to do what you're passionate about. I go back to John Gardner's speech 22 years ago. He said here, and I still remember it, he says, in this rootless, pluralistic life, you bring meaning into your life by what you commit yourself to. And I really thought a lot about that speech. In fact, I have a copy of the speech, and I kept it all these years. And I looked at that speech, and I said, you know what, I'm going to do this. And it's been a lot of fun. It's been taxing, and I have to say, in some respects, it's been more challenging than the private sector, because in the private sector, if it doesn't make business sense, you say no. And oftentimes in this space, you're dealing with human needs, and and you try to rationalize it. But at the end of the day, this is a business. It's a charitable business. And if you don't run it like a business, you run it into the ground. So that is a delicate balancing act. But it'll be one of the most rewarding things you do if you get into this.